opinion about. This is whether we should bring back mandatory testing for those arriving in this country from China. That's COVID testing, of course. Italy's done it, the US has done it, apparently Japan and India have also done it. Our government seems to be thinking about it, despite saying they weren't going to only moments, if not earlier today. My view is that they should not give in to the pressure to be seen to act, not be swept up in a panic all over again, and avoid bringing back these types of rules. I don't think it will prevent variants from getting here. I don't think it'll save lives or protect our freedoms domestically. In fact, I think it will make it far more likely that we'll see a slippery slope back to the hideous lockdown restrictions we had not too long ago. I also want to know what you think about Labour's latest attempts to position themselves as the party of law and order. Now, we discussed last night Labour's analysis of crime data, which showed over 1 million thefts and burglaries went unsolved last year, a truly shocking stat. Now, they've turned their attention to antisocial behaviour. The most eye-catching proposal seems to be that they'll allow the victims of antisocial behaviour to choose how the perpetrators, the offenders, are punished. So if Labour get to power, it could be you, if you're unlucky enough to be a victim of antisocial behaviour, who gets to decide whether the perpetrator gets, say, 40 hours picking up rubbish from the local high street as a punishment, or perhaps 40 hours cleaning up a local community centre, whatever floats your boat. We're also going to be discussing the latest strike action, of course. The new General Secretary of the Trade Unions Congress, the TUC, has warned coordinated strikes may come in the new year if the government doesn't give in to pay demands or at least negotiate. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, says the government will not be held to ransom by striking workers. I'll be asking whether the government should stick to its guns in the face of union threats, or are they losing the high ground in all of this? And finally, is the BBC guilty of rewriting British history? That's what a group of leading academics have warned, that they are doing just that to promote, in quotes, a woke agenda. And they provided a number of examples to back up their claims. Now, all of that to come tonight on Dewbs & Co. I'll also be introducing my top-notch panel in just one moment. But first, let's get the latest news headlines.
Emily, thank you. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The Defence Secretary says the UK's response to China opening up travel abroad is under review. Ben Wallace's comments follow the government saying there were no plans to introduce mandatory COVID-19 tests for arrivals from China, unlike several other countries, including the US and Italy. Beijing has announced plans to reopen borders next week, despite the country's ongoing COVID surge that sparked concern. Mr. Wallace says he expects to know more soon.
Well, I think the government has said it's now going to keep that under review and review whether different countries with COVID outbreaks, etc., should obviously face different restrictions. I think as we speak, that is being reviewed, and I'll expect to see some clarification, I think, by the Department of Transport probably today or tomorrow.
Well, the Defence Secretary also insisted UK borders are safe as the military steps in to cover for striking Border Force officials. Unions claim the country's borders are less secure as more than 1,000 immigration officers walk out in a dispute over pay. A senior source has told GB News that passport control operations are running very smoothly at all 6 airports. A third man has been arrested on suspicion of murdering 23-year-old Cody Fisher on Boxing Day. The non-league football player was stabbed to death in the Crane nightclub in Birmingham, which now faces being shut down. West Midlands police have said a 22-year-old man has been detained in London. He's the third person to be arrested on suspicion of murder, while 4 others have been arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. Merseyside police have said a third person has been arrested in connection with the fatal shooting of a 26-year-old woman in Wirral. Elle Edwards was killed outside a pub on Christmas Eve. Police say a 31-year-old man from Tranmere has been arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to murder. A man and a woman who were previously arrested are still being questioned by officers. Belarus has called for Ukraine to investigate after one of its air defence missiles was fired over its territory. Belarus's defence says it's brought down a Ukrainian S-300 missile, summoning Ukraine's ambassador to investigate to prevent it happening again. It comes on the day of one of the largest Russian strikes since the war began. Ukraine says it's shot down 54 of the 69 Russian missiles fired in the country. which has reportedly left 90% of the western city of Lviv without power. Vladimir Putin could be unseated by his own generals if Ukraine continues to make gains in its counter-offensive. That's according to the former head of the British Army. Speaking to GB News, General Lord Richard Danners said strategic losses and rapidly falling morale could see the Russian leaders in forced removal. But Lord Danners insists it's vital the UK, the US and other allies continue to supply Ukraine with Western weapons.
Yes, it's important that the European countries do. One or two are looking a bit wobbly. Important that European countries stay behind, but really important that Uncle Sam stays behind Ukraine. That's absolutely critical because the sophisticated weaponry that's going in is the game changer.
The Vatican says former Pope Benedict is in a serious but stable condition after concerns were raised over his health. In a statement, it said the 95-year-old is lucid and had rested well overnight. Yesterday, Pope Francis called for prayers for his predecessor, warning he was very sick. The former head of the Catholic Church became the first pope to stand down in 600 years in 2013. At least 19 people have been killed and up to 30 are missing following a huge fire at a hotel casino in Cambodia. That's according to local media. The blaze started around midnight last night at the Grand Diamond City Casino on the border with Thailand. Police say around 400 people were in the building when it caught fire. Authorities are still investigating. The deadly storm that's been sweeping across North America, killing at least 69 people, is now bringing wet and windy weather to the UK. The Met Office says the knock-on effect of America's bomb cyclone will see spells of unsettled weather over the next 7 to 10 days. Forecasters have issued an amber weather alert for heavy rain tomorrow for parts of Scotland, warning of flooding and travel disruption. Some breaking news to bring you in the last few minutes, and new figures show at least 25 children have now died in England from strep A. The UK Health Security Agency says there have been 151 cases of the invasive disease in children aged between 1 and 4 so far this year. That compares to 194 cases in the same age group across both years of 2007 and 2018. Across all age groups, including adults, there have been 122 deaths in England. TV, online and DAB Plus radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Dewbs & Co with Emily.
Thank you, Tatiana. So, yes, welcome to Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver. I will introduce my panel now. We've got political commentator Joe Phillips with us and also former advisor to Liz Truss, Asa Bennett. Short job.
Indeed, but what a ride.
I have to say. Yes, what a ride. Hopefully we can get a little bit of gossip as we go along. Anyway, I also want to know, of course, your thoughts throughout the show, particularly on that first topic that we're going to be covering. Should we bring back mandatory testing for those arriving in this country from China? That's because apparently there is a massive surge of COVID cases in China because they've finally relaxed some of their COVID restrictions over there. Do we really want to see more mandatory testing? Do we want to go back to that world? Please do get in touch with me, gbviews@gbnews.uk or on Twitter @gbnews. So as I was saying, it's a bit of a déjà vu moment for me. The States has become the latest country to impose this mandatory COVID testing on visitors from China. Italy is now urging the rest of the European Union, the whole of the European Union, to do exactly the same thing. Earlier today, a government spokesperson said there were no plans to introduce these tests in this country. But then the Defence Secretary told GB News earlier that the UK's response to China opening up overseas travel is, in quotes, under a review. So I'm asking you, should we follow the US, India, Japan and Italy and return to mandatory testing for those travelling from China? Or could this signal a return to more and more travel restrictions and also infringements on our civil liberties? So, Joe, shall I start with you? What do you think of this?
It makes absolute common sense to test people coming from mainland China, because we cannot trust the data that's come out of China. We don't know the true number of deaths. All we know is they went into an extreme lockdown, then they relaxed it, they let the genie out of the bottle. So we've got no data that we can rely on coming out of China. It seems utterly ridiculous to me to risk going back to the sort of lockdown and the sort of infringements on our lives that you just talked about, if we just allow people to come in from a country where they may well bring in a variant that we don't yet know about. And it just, it doesn't seem a big deal that if you're coming from that place, you're tested.
Well, why only China? COVID is going around many countries across the world, including our own. We have vaccinations in this country that people can opt into. So what's the problem?
Because we can't trust the Chinese data.
So if there are 1 million cases in China, 1 billion cases in China, that's what we should use to be arbiter.
We should use the scientific evidence, because we don't know what variants they've got. And yes, of course, it's going to mutate, and it's probably going to be around for the rest of our lives.
Well, exactly.
In one form or other.
When do we stop testing people?
Why would you bring in something that at the moment doesn't appear to be in this country? Why wouldn't you just use a common sense thing? If you get something like foot and mouth disease on a farm, for instance, you put barriers in so people have to walk through disinfectant. It's not a big deal.
But this isn't a new disease. It's COVID. We've had COVID in this country. We still have it in this country. Flu is worse at the moment, according to the stats, but it's still floating around. We don't even test people very much anymore at all, really. So why would we then launch a new drive to test absolutely everyone coming in from China?
Well, what we've learned over the last few years is when China sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And that's essentially...
That was a new disease, which we knew nothing about, so there was an overreaction, in my view.
But part of that was because we were flying blind. We didn't know how severe it was, we didn't know how sort of recurrent and how much of a spread there was. And so that's why there was general sort of flapping about, in which, looking back, a lot of, armchair generals now say, oh, well, we should have acted faster, we should have been testing, we should have been doing this quicker. And so I think my view is basically, if we are to then be testing, let's decide to get on with it and get on with it sooner. Because look at what's happening with Italy. They've been testing and they find the planes are, half full of people who test positive for COVID. Admittedly, they're not finding, as you say, a new variant, which is obviously interesting and worth flagging. But it's also worth remembering, as viewers will very much remember, China is a living experiment in the art of a zero COVID policy. They try to drive it down, they try to eliminate it, and as a result, they have
which our former health secretary said we should replicate.
Is an interesting point. But then you look at the result, and the population is minimal in its vaccination rates. They have a vaccine that actually was far less effective than we have in the Western world. And as a result, it's generally weaker, and that's why the Chinese government has really had hell to pay for in the domestic backlash.
But what's that got to do with whether we should be bringing back mandatory testing?
Point is, they've not learned to live with it.
This is all about, in my mind, it's not a choice between protecting the freedoms in this country or having this mandatory testing. I don't think if we have this mandatory testing, that will necessarily mean that we are then going to keep our freedoms. In fact, I think it might actually lead to us losing our freedoms, because it whips up this hysteria. If you've been reading the papers today, online and everywhere, there really is a sense of déjà vu, this same fear of what's going on in China. We've had this vaccine. Surely the best thing we should be doing is, telling the Chinese to use our vaccines.
Well, so the way to stop the hysteria is to say, OK, we're going to test. And as ACES rightly says, in Europe, in Italy, they've tested.
What do we do with them?
Well, we don't let them in, or we put them into quarantine, because if they've got a variant that we don't know yet, the last
That's
thing...
such a hypothetical. You can't always...
But, Emily, we're dealing in hypotheticals because, as I said at the outset, we don't have the data from China on what variant it is. Now, I think 16 people from China tested with the Omicron variant, which everybody's quite relieved about, because that is exactly what we're all living with. But if you suddenly get a whole load of people coming from China with a different variant, we will all end up going into lockdown or some constriction.
I don't think it's an either-or, though.
Well, I think it is.
I think if you have... it's not just China that's suffering from COVID, as I said
China,
before.
We can't trust
I
the data.
can just imagine our government and public health officials will be getting their slides ready for, the BBC News 5 p.m. special, where we start looking at, how many people have COVID in China, how many Chinese have come over with COVID, and then again, it whips up the hysteria. People start clamouring for lockdowns, etc., etc. We saw how it went from, saying actually people in China shouldn't be coming over here, they should be tested, etc., etc. And we saw how it ended up with people being locked in their homes, unable to sit on a chair in the park.
No, sure, but it's worth remembering that Rishi Sunak, of course, as was made clear in The Spectator, was someone who was out in front, who flew back from California to stop...
Who's this, sorry?
Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. That he was against the Christmas lockdown that I think Boris was being sort of pushed by Sage and all the rest into doing. So he's actually got, good, sound principles on this, and you can imagine that he's not going to be reaching for lockdown as the first reaction. He's going to be, we have learnt to live with COVID. China has not. That is the problem. I
don't know about that, because if you cast your mind back, there was so much pressure from the media, from public health, from other governments around the world for our government to take steps that I don't believe Boris Johnson at the time wished to ever do.
But that was then. We're talking about now. And nobody is for 1 minute suggesting that the UK or indeed the rest of Europe go into any sort of lockdown. But what we are saying, or people like me are saying, and other people as well, is that actually it makes common sense. You're only testing people coming from mainland China.
But I don't think anyone would be talking about it if it weren't for the fact that it had been put in the media today and yesterday, that they were even thinking about this, or that this was under review, or that Italy was doing it. People would be living their lives as per normal.
We wouldn't be talking about anything on this programme if it hadn't been in the media. Everything we're talking about is in the media.
But the point I'm trying to make is that hysteria breeds hysteria, and I do worry the consequences of that. But I think I may well be in a minority. Before we go to the break, I'm going to just read out some of your comments, actually, from those of you at home watching. Daniel says, in my opinion, yes, we should bring back mandatory testing to those who are entering the UK. Terence says, this is a no-brainer. We did nothing the first time around until it was too late. Sylvia says, definitely, we should have compulsory testing of incoming Chinese travellers to the UK, etc., etc. Jonathan, however, is with me. Emily, I really hope the government sticks to their guns. No doubt the Chinese are itching to travel and spend their hard-earned money, and so benefiting our economy. Well, apparently that's what Germany and Austria are saying, and also France, I believe. They desperately don't want to close the doors to the Chinese. Kristen says, I don't see the point of introducing testing. It was proven to be useless when we had it before in preventing the spread of the disease. If we do test it, it should just be to check that our vaccines could reduce the seriousness. I think that's a good point, to be honest. What exactly are we going to achieve by testing? Do we really want to be locking down the Chinese in some kind of facility for 10 days until we know that they haven't got COVID? It's all a bit mad to me. It does seem like Groundhog Day and some horrible nightmare re-emerging in my mind anyway. So please do keep your views coming in. It does seem that most people are in disagreement with me, but I'm sure some of you agree with me on this one. Anyway, Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary has said that a Labour government would allow victims to choose offenders' punishments for antisocial behaviour. Is that a gimmick, or is it a good idea?
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Now, a lot of you have been getting in. I'm getting email after email after email about whether we should bring in mandatory testing when it comes to the Chinese coming over here. And I can't help but suspect that people's suspicions of China, which are fair enough and well-placed, may be having an impact on their views in terms of not trusting the Chinese. I come from it from a philosophical standpoint. I worry that if we start bringing back this kind of rules, these kind of stringent rules that were in place throughout the pandemic or for much of it, that we're going to go back. We're going to hit, the reverse button. We're going to go back to the horrible times of lockdown and constant death tolls, etc., etc. I don't want to go back to that. But Sarah very much disagrees with me. She says, never thought I'd agree with Joe Phillips.
Well, there we go, Sarah. It's not so hard.
It's quite simple, Emily. China lied and thousands died. Testing is not locking down, but it does get here again with a different strain. We are done if it does get here again. Steve says, who pays for all of these tests? What is the point when you can test negative one day and positive 24 hours later? How reliable are the tests anyway? That's a very good point. There have been some dodgy tests and we're all going to have to fork out for them. But I don't know how many travellers come from China every year anyway. I imagine it will hit students very heavily and also people with a lot of spending power, which we could do with on our high streets anyway. Anyway, this is Dewbs & Co, of course, with me, Emily Carver. I will reintroduce my panel, political commentator Joe Phillips.
And Sarah's new friend.
Who is a fan favourite this evening. And, of course, former advisor to Liz Truss, Asa Bennett.
You've done other things,
Well, absolutely.
Yes, what else have you done?
All
Go
singing,
on.
all dancing.
Please tell us your CV. What the highlights?
Former Telegraph journalist and now guest tonight.
You were fantastic at the Telegraph, I must say.
Extremely kind.
Labour have recently announced a radical new plan to tackle crime which involves victims of antisocial behaviour choosing how offenders are punished. So if you were a victim of some kind of antisocial behaviour, presumably that means graffiti on your private property, someone, I don't know, knifing your tyre on your car or creating lots of noise outside your home late at night, you could actually choose whether the perpetrator has to perhaps pick up rubbish, remove that graffiti, decorate a community centre or whatnot. So this is all part of the Labour Party's plans to prove to the electorate that they are tough on crime. Is this the answer, or is this just another idea that looks better on paper than it does in practice? Asa, I'm going to go to you first on this.
Yes.
What do you make of this? Is it a gimmick or has it got some legs?
Well, look, it seems appealing at first, but then you just scrape beneath the layers of it and you find that it's not the kind of Labour's offer that you have revenge on criminals, your fantasies run wild. It's that you would get to sit on a community payback board and make sure that they oversee and are made to do their community sentences rather than just picking a punishment and then that's what they have to do. I think ultimately it comes as part of a mission for Labour to try and invent their new version of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Instead, you've got the slogan of prevent, punish and protect. We'll see how that lands. But I think where it's really interesting is because they're stepping up this idea of Crime Week, Crime Day. This is where we're talking about antisocial behaviour. It's to try and appeal to the GB News viewers. It's to try and appeal to the red wall, blue wall, to show that they get the core issues.
People, everyone's worried about crime.
Absolutely, it's the doorstep issue, and fundamentally Labour will want to probably ask, given that Keir Starmer, don't you know, he used to be former head of Director of Public Prosecutions, lock up the wrong uns and all that stuff, that they want to try and show, do you feel safer than you were 10 years ago? That's the issue they want to ask voters. We'll see how that turns out.
It's quite interesting because, I think this is a great tactic I mean, I am very concerned. Yesterday we were talking about burglaries and thefts that have gone unresolved. That's happened to me twice, 3 times. Just get a number and that's it for insurance purposes. And then also when it comes to these kind of community offences or antisocial behaviour offences, that's something that seems to just carry on without any punishment delivered. What do you make of this? Do you think they're onto a winner?
Well, I think people, I'm sure Sarah will agree with me again. Who knows, I might even get another viewer. But I think most of us have had some experience of antisocial behaviour, and most communities are, to a degree or other, blighted by whether it's littering or graffiti or mindless vandalism or, those little things that actually begin to destroy community spirit and civic life. They're the things that the police don't have the resources all the time or the inclination to deal with. But I think there are 2 points here. One is that I think it's good that Labour is talking about it, because it is recognising that it is another part of where people feel powerless, helpless, as though, the things that they used to expect to look after them aren't working anymore. The other thing that I think would be really smart and clever is to look at the existing powers that councils have in terms of enforcement. So many local authorities use enforcement officers for littering and drinking in places they shouldn't be drinking and things like that.
Putting a cigarette out on the floor.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Now, many of them are using it just to fine people. It's a way to rake in money. They're not actually doing anything about stopping it other than, I'll remember not to let the baby throw a sweet wrapper on the floor because I'll get an 80 quid fine or whatever it is. So I think, in essence, this is something worth talking about, because what happens is, although, to be fair to the government, they have used community sentencing a lot more, they don't actually. There is no particular way of making sure that it's done, that it's carried out, and that it's carried out properly. In fact,
I mean, that is quite extraordinary. You would have thought that if a punishment is dished out, someone would be monitoring whether it... Well, I would have assumed that it would be the police or, as you say, the local authorities, the councils.
And I think one of the things here is that you need to do this quickly, and I think you need to do it sensibly. What you don't want to do is to try and find the perpetrators who've sprayed graffiti or whatever it is. You actually almost need to have a sort of a summary justicing, because by the time somebody's gone to court, and we all know the backlogs in court, and then it needs people, in a way, to be facing their own communities in order to get that sense of, OK, so you wrecked that kid's playground, now you need to rebuild it.
But this all relies, of course, on the culprits being caught, does it not? Could you give us a bit of balance? There's been a lot of sort of celebrating Labour as this party of law and order. What were Labour like when it came to law and order? Because mixed reviews. I mean, let's look at Sadiq Khan's London, knife crime through the roof. Andy Burnham, the police under his watch were under special measures, I believe. So does Labour have credibility?
I was thinking exactly of that. Just look at what they do when they have their hands on the levers of power, when they are responsible, like in Sadiq's case, for scrutinising what the police do in London. And there you have I think it was just in 1 year alone, you had crime increasing in London 5 times as fast than in the rest of England. And at the same time, you've got Mark Drakeford in Wales, who seems to overcompensate by being sort of uber-authoritarian and during COVID, as we know, and having it, I think he basically tried to criminalise going out to work at one point.
Well, remember the, what was it? They put warning signs around essential items or non-essential items in shops.
Exactly.
Oh, my God, that's a blast from the past. Anyway.
Sorry to give you sort of COVID flashbacks for a second, but fundamentally what I'm trying to say is this, that they're all over the place on crime, Labour, and so this is where they have to, clearly that's why they're trying to double down to show they actually have an act they could do if you give them control to the entire United Kingdom. And so you can only imagine what they would do, and this is why Mr Reid clearly is trying to show that there is some grit, but, is there credibility there? I mean, the Tories would say that this is the party who, under Jeremy Corbyn, they were voting against giving the police funding, against tougher sentences for,
But this is quite interesting, actually, within the Labour Party, because
Jeremy
there are
Corbyn
a lot
was never in power, and Jeremy Corbyn cost the Labour Party the last election. So that's ridiculous. That's like saying, what would have happened under Liz Truss, or what would have happened under Penny Mordaunt?
And since Corbyn, they've been voting against the measures that the Tories have been doing to try and crack down on protesters, crack down on Extinction Rebellion, and all sorts of antisocial behaviour. behaviour.
That's not what this is about, Asa. These things are the things that are happening in villages and towns. You know, rural crime is something that I'm extremely well aware of because I don't live in a city. And, you know, the problems facing farmers and people in rural communities of even getting the police to pick up the phone, never mind investigate, never mind follow through when somebody says, I know where my vehicle is, I know where my livestock is, and you've got the evidence. So I think people have lost faith with the police, and we've often talked about that on this programme. Just to make the point on London, I mean, Sadiq Khan, I think, has dragged his heels quite a lot, but he had to fight very hard to get rid of Cressida Dick, who was overseeing the police in London and on whose watch we saw Wayne Couzens and the murder of Sarah Everard.
Well, Sadiq Khan is always the first to pass the buck.
Yes, he chairs a board that literally monitors the Met Police.
Yes, I know, but he did have to fight Priti Patel and fight pretty hard to get rid of Cressida Dick.
Can I squeeze one quick extra point in?
Yes,
which is, it's just interesting also that the Tories, like, you know, when Liz was just running to be Prime Minister and all that, they basically are campaigning to try and toughen things up on crime. So it's like they're never quite happy themselves. So the Tories wouldn't defend the status quo themselves. So there's almost a cross-party consensus that things have to change and things have to improve.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. And I think it's where we need to have proper conversations, and it's about having conversations that aren't always from the top. And I like this idea that in communities, that if you have members of the local community saying, actually, we don't want you to just go and paint that youth centre. We want you to clear up the litter on this street.
Yeah,
or whatever.
Surely victims of crime shouldn't be able to decide
but this
how
is not
perpetrators are. Well, it feels a little bit like that,
but these are not crimes
because you are essentially. Should you even be involved in what punishment is dished out?
But I don't know, and I agree with that point, Emily. But I don't think that, you know, we're not talking about crimes against the person. We're talking about antisocial behaviour, which affects all of us. So if you if you have, like, the local parish councillor or a local councillor sitting on this board, I don't think for 1 minute we're going back to the stocks in the village square.
I think it's quite interesting, though. I do think the point about the internal politics of the Labour Party is interesting, and it's something that will play out if Labour come into power, because one of the things that hasn't really been an eye-catching proposal, but Keir Starmer and his I can't remember the name of the Shadow Justice Secretary who's announced all this. Yes.
Oh, Steve Reid.
Steve Reid. He said that Labour would not decriminalise drugs, for example. That is something that many left-wing activists within the party would love to see. They'd love to see decriminalisation, if not legalisation,
and doctors as well. I mean, it's not
drugs.
Just left-wing activists.
No, but they are very vocal. And Keir Starmer has, to his credit, done a good job of silencing them or dampening them. But once Labour, if they do get into power, things might change a little bit. There might be quite a backlash against harder, tougher sentencing and whatnot.
Well, a bit like the Conservative Party that, you know, some people would like to think was a one-nation Conservative Party, but has actually been held to ransom and has held the country to ransom.
But some people say that the Conservatives have gone too far in the left-wing.
Well, they haven't. They've gone far too right-wing because successive Prime Ministers have been so terrified of their Brexit anti-European.
But I don't think necessarily you can't call Brexit a right-wing endeavour anyway. I would say that there's been huge amounts of involvement of the government in basically every section of our lives, completely in the economy, massive tax rises, massive regulation. It's not really the free market economics of Liz Truss, or at least what she tried to do anyway.
It was a national enterprise. 17.4 million voted for Brexit, as we know, and, you know, hey, it's done. We're getting on with the benefits.
I must go to the viewers at home because we've had lots of emails about Labour's plans for antisocial behaviour. Ian says, what a joke. It was the Blair Labour government that stripped the police of a lot of their search and arrest powers because they unfairly targeted ethnic minorities in their view. So now the criminals just walk laughing past the helpless police while hurling abuse at them. Mike says, it's amusing our local police force was rated as excellent. Hull, Humberside Police. Literally, our home was broken into in September. My cars were broken into twice in a year. My neighbour's shed broken into and bikes stolen. Nothing comes of it but crime numbers. Antisocial behaviour is rife. So, yeah, Labour's idea is brilliant, isn't it, for those million unsolved crimes. Please do keep your opinions coming in. I've got lots more to read out after the break. I believe we are going to a break, but coming up, the new General Secretary of the Trade Union in Congress, that's the TUC, has warned of coordinated strikes among unions in the new year unless the government steps in to resolve ongoing pay disputes. Should the government cave into the pressure or should they stick to their guns? That's coming up.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store? You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Yes, welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Emily Carver. Now I'll reintroduce my panel. We've got political commentator Joe Phillips with us, who is quite the fan favourite this evening.
Well, there's a change.
You seem to be spot on with your views, apparently, according to some of our emails anyway. And former advisor to Liz Truss and also formerly at The Telegraph, of course, Asa Bennett. Now, you've been sending in your opinions thick and fast, particularly on the COVID testing, whether we should be bringing back mandatory testing for the Chinese when they arrive in the UK. That's because COVID rates have gone up in that country, as we know. But also about Labour's plans for antisocial behaviour. Should you be able to decide what punishment the perpetrator of a crime gets? Oliver says victims could be threatened into choosing a less severe punishment. This creates a system that allows for corruption. That's very true. There are a lot of people out there who would say, oh, don't punish them. They didn't mean well. They were hard done by as a child. You know, whatever other reason there might be. They've been victimised at school. It's not their fault that they perpetrated this crime. We'll just let them off with a slap on the wrist and absolutely no community service. That's a bit of a risk, isn't it, Joe? We'd go a bit soft, some people.
I think the problem is that it takes such a long time to process it, and by the time these things get to court, because they're low priority, I mean, you know, we're looking at 1,000 days minimum for a rape trial to come to court. So you imagine what that feels like if you're the victim or indeed you're the accused. So something like this is going to take a very long time, and I think that's why I say I think if you're going to do it, you need to do it quickly, and you need to say, it's something that would not carry a criminal record. So, in other words, it certainly is not Crown Court level, and it probably is not really magistrates level. I mean, you know, at the risk of sounding about 570, it's a bit like in the old days when the local bobby would actually take you back to your mum and dad and say, I caught...
Oh, the good old days.
Well, I mean, the good old days
where people
or not.
feared and respected the police force.
Or they actually knew the people, because the thing is that a lot of the crimes that are committed that are, as I say, a blight on communities are committed by people within that community.
Yes.
And that seems to me to be the central nub and the interesting
Although where
point
I grew up, it was definitely people coming from other areas within the borough who would come and, target the middle-class areas because they had, I don't know, nice cars outside, and it was an easy steal because, yes, the police never dealt with the crimes anyway. Anyway, we're going to be moving on. I'll get your view on this first.
Of course.
According to the Evening Standard, the new General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress has warned or threatened that more coordinated strikes among unions lie ahead in the new year unless the government steps in to settle pay disputes. However, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace spoke quite robustly earlier today when he said, "We're not going back to the 70s where the trade union barons thought that they run the government." Unions say that they have a responsibility to support striking workers, which means coordinated action is required. But what about the hard-working British public? Asa, what do you think? We seem to have come to a stalemate here. Neither side are willing to budge.
Yeah, we're basically looking at a Mexican standoff between the government, the unions and the public, sort of watching on amid all this. But under the surface, there are reports we see elsewhere about maybe Mick Lynch is going to inch towards a deal on railways and with enough creative language and jiggery-pokery. But fundamentally, you take a step back when you listen to and watch all this, and it's a test of authority. It's a test of wills. It's a game of bluff, as it were, because at some point the public sympathy runs dry for these industries. It's certainly very, I can understand why they're going on strike because, of course, inflation's through the roof and amid COVID and all the fallout from this war in Ukraine. And so people are wanting to try and push for pay rises. But then there is a limit. The government's made clear.
But isn't the problem at the moment that the government is less popular than even the most militant of trade union barons?
And that nurses are fantastically popular. And so as much as you try and say, well, we'll wait for the public to turn against the nurses, then that is a really hard sell.
Which they're never going to do.
No, of course.
Really, unless the nurses went on strike for weeks on end. I don't think the mood would change. Now, Jo, you have a close experience of these strikes?
Yes, I think you're referring to the fact that my son's a paramedic.
Yes.
But you could also refer to the fact that many, many years ago I was an industrial correspondent and I have written a book, Why Join a Trade Union?
Oh, well, there you go.
So there you are. I've got quite a lot of it. It's a very old book now. But I think, the government has got it wrong from the outset on this. They keep using the language of the 1970s. They're talking to, 3 people who read the Daily Express, who remember the old days of Red Robbo and at a time when we knew the names of trade union leaders more than we knew the names
Do you not think there are parallels?
No, I don't. I don't think you could put Pat Cullen, leader of the Royal College of Nursing, in the category of union baron, nor do I think you could put Mick Lynch in the category of union...
Mick Lynch is definitely trying out for the role.
Look, but this idea that it's them or us is ridiculous. These are people, nurses and health workers, postal workers, train drivers, all of these people kept things going, and all of these people have seen real drop in their income. And it's not just about pay. If you are working as a nurse or a paramedic, you are not able to do the job that you have gone into, not for the money, but because you care about it, because the health service is broken. And I know that's a whole different conversation. You do a 12-hour shift, you can't get another bed in. You can't get another patient out. You can't get the patient out of the ambulance. You know perfectly well, before the strikes, 3 people, my son told me this the other day, 3 people in one area, in one day, one shift, died waiting for ambulances because they went...
But how does striking help?
Because if you
we know that the situation in the NHS is dire.
Because
we know it is.
But they're saying to people, we are desperate. You've got to talk to us.
But the problem is, it's the same people who are out on the picket lines who refuse to acknowledge that perhaps the NHS needs a massive change of direction.
I don't think that's true at all. I think many, many people within the health service who work for the health service, and indeed Labour's shadow health secretary, Wes Streeting, they've all been talking about the way we need to change things. A better local thing. Patricia Hewitt, former health secretary, who's doing a review for the government, is already mooted to be talking about getting rid of national targets, making them local. We know the health service is broken, but it has been like this for many, many years. The government should at least give these people the respect of sitting down and talking to them.
Can I ask Jo one question?
Yeah, go for it.
Basically, just At a time when the private sector, you're seeing pay freezes, redundancies all over the shop there. Why? It sounds like your solution is just give everyone in the public sector inflation busting pay rises.
No, it's not. But I do think there is a huge question about pay review boards. And this is one of the things that Paul Novak was talking about this morning, that there is great secrecy. You know, you and I might know who sits on these pay review boards, but they're not open to scrutiny from any common select committee.
I think that the whole way that pay is decided should be ripped up and started again. I don't think there should be collective bargaining. I think it should be like in private business, that you're paid on performance, or your pay is locally decided rather than across
how do you
the
get paid
entire
on performance
UK?
If you haven't seen as many patients, let's say, as you would like to?
Well, I mean, how do you judge anyone's performance in a job? You have certain KPIs, you have certain targets, your manager knows how hard you're working.
Well,
I just think it's ridiculous and very antiquated, don't you think, Asa, the way that pay is bargained, was decided?
Well, I'm just still amazed that, you know, strikes literally serve to disrupt and, you know, services through the withdrawal of labour. We know that. First principles of what strikes are about. And so then suddenly this sort of surprise that the health service is under unprecedented amounts of pressure this winter, because you've had days where people are literally getting taxis to get themselves into these hospitals, and there's backlogs, you know, now spiralling upwards. This is what we're seeing. You're not helping the NHS by suddenly going on strike. You're making that as a conscious decision to make things worse.
Yeah, what I must say is I think the government should... Sorry, we're going to have to move to the break, but we'll come back to it after the break, I think. But I do think that the government needs to level with the public and say, you know what? We are going through a really, really tough economic patch, and people just simply aren't going to be able to get the pay that they believe they deserve, and that arguably they do deserve for the work that they do. Anyway, we're going to go to a couple of opinions, so perhaps I will get your opinion on those. Wayne says, anyone who can't live on 24 grand a year needs to be looking at their lifestyle, not going on strike. Well, it depends where you live, doesn't it?
Well, it depends.
In some parts of the country, that will buy you absolutely nowhere to live at all. But in other areas, you could be able to budget and live an OK life. Michael says the union barons' agenda is purely political, to create anarchy and turmoil, to use the strikers as cannon fodder to bring down an elected government and destroy the democratic process. Now, I think both things can be true. I think the union barons do have an agenda. They would love to see the back of the Tories. They would love to see a socialist work.
This is lazy.
People like Mick Lynch, who stand up with his commie mates, and that is fact. Some of the leadership
Sharon
of
Graham is
RMT.
an elected leader. These are people elected by the members of their union.
Oh, come on. You can accept that people deserve better pay for the job that they do, and also acknowledge that the unions want coordinated strike action because one of their ambitions is to not have a Conservative government.
Do you not think that it would be a grown-up, mature and sensible thing to do for Rishi Sunak, who is not doing terrifically well in the polls, who is 2 years off from an election, to sit down and look like a reasonable person and say, let's have a conversation?
I think the problem is that if he does that, he will have to essentially boost pay across the board, which he would argue would cripple us even more in terms of our finances. But even if we had a conversation,
Emily, and said, look, we can't do it now, but I promise you, because don't forget, government sets the envelope within which the pay review board has to work.
I think they just don't want to be seen to be giving into this sort of strike pressure. They
they're
don't
on
want
the
to
wrong
deal with
footing.
terrorists or whatever they might.
Oh, it's so much easier.
Anyway, we're going to have to go. We're going to have to go to the break, because coming up is the BBC rewriting British history to promote a woke agenda. A group of academics has accused the broadcaster of pandering to politically motivated activists. Is that true? And apparently even maths isn't safe from wokery, because professors are being pressured to explain how they are presenting a multicultural and decolonised view of the subject. We'll get stuck into that just after the break.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us. We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing. You see, amazing.
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Right, welcome back to Dewbs and Co. So the BBC has been accused of rewriting British history to promote a woke agenda. That's what a group of the country's leading academics have warned. The authors of the report, titled "Can We Trust the BBC with Our History?", called on the BBC to tighten its editorial guidelines. If that wasn't enough, we also have dozens of leading academics writing to the government to call for more protections on free speech at universities, where many professors fear it is too personally risky to challenge the decolonisation agenda, not in history, English or social sciences, but in maths. Make this make sense, Asa.
So, in short, a study by a bunch of very small C conservative historians, they pointed out that the BBC, it's trying to be all things to all people. So, as a result, yes, it may occasionally commission excellent documentaries about how marvellous the Queen is, or sort of how fantastic Thatcher and Reagan were with Charles Moore, presenting it. But it'll also have a whole spate of documentaries that are sort of appealing to the more millennial crowd that decide when talking about slavery to get very sort of self-flagellating about it, rather than saying, yes, that Britain did lead the way in abolishing slavery and all that. So they got on bang to rights, essentially, on helping sort of very much push out sort of your wokery as well as all sorts of other content.
Yes, I think a lot of people on the left dismiss this kind of story and just say, oh, who cares, it's just culture wars nonsense. But this report has actually detailed many examples that they say are leading to getting the facts wrong, essentially, in order to appease, I guess, what some might call the woke mob, or those concerned about identity politics more than facts.
I think there are a couple of things here. One is that I think the BBC, along with every other broadcaster in the entire universe, is always looking for different presenters. We have moved a long way from the days of Kenneth Clark and Civilization, and in fact the gentleman who was talking to Patrick earlier, who I think was a history professor. OK, they use comedians in the same way as they use Michael Portillo to talk about train journeys. They use Ed Balls to do, behind the scenes on various other things. So, broadcasters are always looking for different presenters that they hope will connect with a different audience. But there are questions about accuracy. And I think that is, that's a perfectly valid comment.
Yes, particularly over issues to do with the slave trade. Not acknowledging the role of Churchill in a positive light. Someone's accused of there being a fatwa against him at the BBC. And, I wouldn't be surprised if they've run documentaries on, was Churchill a racist? I mean, it's the choice of topic, is it not?
Well,
that enrages some people.
I think there is a certain group of people who will, as Asa was saying, slightly tongue-in-cheek, they would like to see things how it used to be. Lots and lots of documentaries about the Queen, lots of, bring back Barbara Walters and walkies and dogs, and let's go back to only having people who are
I don't think it's that. I think people are genuinely fed up of feeling like their country is constantly under attack by one of their most cherished institutions, which was, of course, the BBC, Asa.
Yeah, I think certainly the BBC is happier worrying about British history far more than the history of other countries in that sense. It very much is sort of, maybe this is the British tradition trying to sort of send itself up a bit more in that sense. But I think certainly it does speak to that truth with history that it is endlessly debated. But the thing is, the BBC does like to somewhat amplify the more tendentious viewpoints.
Now, just very quickly, one word on this. Maths. Does it need to be decolonised, Asa?
Well, I've apparently heard that not only is maths racist, but also getting the right answer is racist in maths. And now it's about, feelings and lived experience. So, look, this debate will run. Of course it's not.
I think we should listen to these academics. I mean, if they're being challenged to decolonise maths...
Yeah, I don't even know where you'd start. That one stumps me,
well,
I'm afraid.
Let me know.
Maths does.
Those at home, let me know if you understand what it means to decolonise maths. Can maths be racist? Anyway, that's all we've got time for this evening. Thank you so much for getting in touch throughout the show. We covered all sorts, from mandatory tests on Chinese tourists to this country to, of course, the BBC, whether it's the British bashing corporation, in some people's view, apparently. Thank you very much for tuning in. We, of course, had Asa Bennett and Joe Phillips with us this evening, so very big thank you to them. Now we're going to be going to Nigel Farage, who is with us now, I believe.
Yes,
there he is.
I'm with you. Thank you. Good evening. I thought it was the Brussels Broadcasting Corporation, but perhaps I've got that wrong. We're going to have, in a couple of minutes' time, some exclusive polling to GB News. It'll tell you, across the wider country and in Scotland too, how many people support Nicola Sturgeon's new legislation on gender identity. And I do hope Nicola Sturgeon tunes in, because the results are absolutely fascinating. And we'll be asking you, the audience at home, do you support the new gender laws? Before all of that, let's have a look at the increasingly windy weather.
Hello there, I'm Claire Nazir with your weather update. An amber warning for heavy rain has been issued across the southern parts of Scotland, a broad yellow warning for rain, Northern Ireland, central and southern areas of Scotland, and a warning for snow and ice across northern Scotland. Yes, the weather remains unsettled and cold in places, particularly in the north. One area of low pressure clearing towards the far north, another one approaching from the west. And this is an area of heavy rain, which will track across Northern Ireland, clipping northern England and pushing towards Scotland. At the same time, rain will approach Wales as well as the West Country as the winds pick up some strength. And the winds will be a feature of the weather through the first part of Friday. Severe gales across the North Channel, gales across Irish Sea coast as well as Channel coast, and a wet and windy start to the day. So that amber warning reflects the fact that there's going to be issues on the roads with surface water, high rainfall totals. We could actually see some flooding here, so a risk of some really quite torrential rain for a time, but it clears quite quickly. By lunchtime, most places seeing some drier skies away from Shetland as well as Orkney, although a legacy of showers will arrive across Northern Ireland and Scotland through the afternoon. A blustery breeze here, a few showers running in across the southeast of England. Now overnight, some clearer skies yet again across more southern areas. Still icy across the far north of Scotland with the risk of snow above around 200 metres. And then some sporadic bursts of rain come in from the west across many parts as we head into the early hours of New Year's Eve. So still unsettled for the last day of 2022. Rain comes and goes through the day on New Year's Eve. Still a keen breeze coming in from the southwest. Even so, Scotland and Northern Ireland will remain cold. And through the day, the rain will intensify across more southern areas. A blustery day wherever you are, with showers to follow across more western areas, but even a little sunshine to end 2022 for Northern Ireland. Temperatures then will struggle in the north, milder in the south. And here's your outlook into the beginning of 2023. Dry skies on Monday with even some sunshine.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late night paper review that won't send you to sleep like the others will. 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewbs, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewbs, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.